which I'm still willing to talk about Colin's desk as much as we need to. Yeah, but he the Febreze is funny. He also has a curved monitor, which I've thought about it, but I don't use a curved monitor. He likes it a lot. He has one here and he has one at his house as well. Also, Colin had a baby today, which is crazy. And part of the reason he's not here is he's distracted with having a baby. I could send out a photo of my desk. My desk is pretty boring. I have an Apple Watch. I have a charger for AirPods. I have 2 keyboards because I have a keyboard that I use during the class, and when I'm on calls, which is like fairly quiet. And then I have like a clickety clackety loud keyboard in front of it. But I could try to send out some photos. And I use two monitors. They're 27-inch LG 4K monitors. I think they're great. Okay, we're gonna get started here. I'm going to take a little bit of time here to introduce our guest. And then I'm going to, well, I guess I'm going to bring them on as a panelist right now, and then I'm going to introduce them. So. Okay, hopefully that's going to work. Yeah, nice. So our guest today is Eileen Uchitelle. Eileen is a principal engineer at GitHub. So I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. That's pretty good. Eileen is a principal engineer, which means she works on the hardest problems that GitHub has. She works across teams. She works across orgs. She does everything. In addition to that, she's also a core contributor to Rails. So Rails, which we're starting actually learning Rails today, Eileen. Rails has a lot of people that contribute to it, but there are a core group of people that work on Rails, and Eileen is one of them. It takes a long time to get to that because there's actually several levels, much like engineering levels, there's several levels of contributing to Rails. So she is, again, at the highest level of contributing to Rails. She's a core contributor. She's also a common conference speaker. So she speaks at conferences. She keynotes at conferences like RailsConf and RubyConf. And in addition, I consider Eileen to be just an amazing friend in person. We pair a couple times a day. I really like even just having an hour talking to Eileen. And hopefully she likes it too. But she's going to speak to you a little bit about her journey that brought her to where she is, and then she'll answer some questions. She won't be able to answer, I think, all of them, but if you have questions while she's talking, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to have Eileen start.
Okay, can you hear me? I haven't done a webinar thing before. These are weird. Anyway, hi everybody, I'm Eileen. As John said, I work at GitHub. I've been at GitHub for four years, since 2017. And I upgraded our application from like a Rails 3.2 fork that was custom all the way to 5.2 and then 6. And then I, kind of encouraged other people to do it. And now we run GitHub off of Rails main branch, which means that every other week we upgrade to the newest SHA on Rails. I don't know if you've covered Git yet, so SHA might be a word that I shouldn't use yet. It's the little numbers at the end of your commit. And so that we just pick whatever the most recent one is and then deploy that to GitHub, which is a fun way to use Rails on the bleeding edge. I'm on the Rails core team, but John already covered that. I think I've been on the core teams also almost as long as I've been at GitHub, so that's cool. I got into working in tech in sort of like a backwards way. I was an art major in college, photography major, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Being an art major doesn't always get you jobs with money. There's a lot of people who want to ask you to do something, for what they say, like for exposure, which is just a fancy word for free work. So you gotta like figure out what to do. And I, did a few internships for photographers and realized that I just didn't want to like work in someone's shadow until I could make it big. So I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But one day I was supposed to take a printmaking class, and the school was like, no one who isn't a printmaking major can take this class because we don't know how to structure classes properly. So they kicked everyone out who wasn't a printmaking major. And I was like, what classes are available for me to take? And there was a Flash class. So I took a Flash class and I learned ActionScript and Flash. And it's like kind of funny because I feel like in like 5 years, if I tell people who are like first graduating from college now about Flash, they'll be like, what's Flash? It's going to be like COBOL. Like there's just lore about it, and no one's gonna. I actually tried to like run my Flash files the other day because I'm actually talking about part of this in my RailsConf talk, and I wanted to get a copy of my first website, and I can't figure out how to run the Swift files at all. So you'll have to believe me that that's how that went. And I really liked it. Like I really enjoyed the mesh between programming and art and creativity. So I took a couple more classes. I learned some HTML and CSS. I graduated in 2009 with like still not an idea of what I wanted to do, but I was like, well, I've got some programming-ish. It was like still kind of like making it work, not really, didn't know what I was doing. And got some design and some photography. And I was like, I'll just apply to any job, anyone who will hire me. And so the first place that hired me was a dentist's office marketing department, which is such a weird thing because dentist office don't usually have marketing departments, at least in the US. It seems kind of like a weird thing. And so, but it turned out like I thought, oh, great, I'll get to learn from other people. But it turned out I was the only developer that worked there. And so it was just sort of like feeling my way through like, how do things work? And around the same time, I got a internship at a digital media agency that did advertising and websites and lots of like WordPress stuff. And so I started working there as a designer, doing Flash ads actually. And then, it was a small enough company that I could just learn other stuff. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll like figure out how to make this WordPress thing. And yeah, sure, I'll like do wireframes for this website. Yeah, I'll like figure out how to deploy stuff. And like starting there, I really like is Dreamweaver still a thing? I don't know. So like I didn't even know what a text editor was. I like used Dreamweaver, and like within like an hour of being there, I was like, oh, I can't tell anyone I use Dreamweaver. That's embarrassing. So I had to figure out a text editor pretty quickly. And I think at the time we were using SVN a lot. That's like kind of before Git. Everyone switched to Git, like even though Git was around. I don't know why. I don't know why that shift happened. Someone's got to tell me why. But I learned a lot there in like, I think I was there for 3 years, and probably at like year 2.5, I did a 7-day boot camp at Big Nerd Ranch, who's actually still around, but I don't think they do Ruby and Rails anymore. And so I learned more in-depth Rails and Ruby. And it was kind of funny because at that class, I remember they had someone come in to talk to us about what it was like to contribute to Rails. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's really cool, but like, I'm never going to do that. That's like big, scary stuff, like changing the framework. So then I started working, I left that agency for a company called FishMe that does like spear phishing software. So like they send you an email, and if you click the email, then they tell your employer, and then your employer goes, here's some education on how to like not click bad emails. So that was like a kind of a cool product, because like I really like security stuff too. So I'm mixing security with Rails, and it was my first Rails app that I really got to dive deep into. And I learned a lot there. I learned how to take databases down, which is not a joke. I built a project for their demo sales server, and I didn't realize that you can overload MySQL at the time. And so I took it down trying to insert data into the demo database. But through that work, I figured out like a bunch of stuff with Active Record that, there's ways that you can write it inefficiently, and you'll learn about Active Record. It's the database ORM in Rails. It's basically like a wrapper that lets you talk to the database without having to write raw SQL. And this will make a lot more sense once you start getting into Rails. But Rails like kind of wraps your stuff and makes it easy. So instead of like writing select star from all blah, 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 you just say like user.first. And so you get the first user out of the database. And, but you can write queries that are inefficient. And so I wrote an inefficient query, it took the database down. And that sort of taught me like, oh, there's these really interesting things in active record that you have to like consider. And I actually found a bug in Rails and I didn't know it. So I put all this behavior that I found and I put it in a talk, and you know, I could go on forever. I'm actually going to talk about some of this at RailsConf, so you should watch my RailsConf talk so you can get the full story. So I'm not going to talk about figuring out how to speak at conferences because that was a whole terrifying experience for me as well. So I put this talk together and I give the talk, and at the conference is someone named Aaron Patterson. If you follow him on Twitter, he's Tenderlove. You might be like, that's a weird handle. I don't know. Anyway, so he was at the conference and he was on the Rails, he's on the Rails core team. And he was like, hey, that sounds a lot like a bug. Why don't they fix it? Meaning, why doesn't Rails core fix it? And I said to him, I don't know, why don't they? And so shortly after that, he was like, hey, just let's pair on the bug. So we paired on the bug and we fixed the bug. And that was the beginning of the long journey of getting onto Rails core. We worked a lot on different various bugs in active record. We worked on performance improvements, and then I started doing some of my own stuff. I wrote the system testing framework in Rails. I extracted the, I like multiple database handling, which is like when you want to switch database stuff, and I don't want to get too deep into it because I know that a lot of you are just getting into this, but when you start building big web applications, you're going to need that multiple database API. And actually, John helped me with part of it. And we're also going to talk about that at RailsConf. Spoiler, John's my special guest at RailsConf. And I don't know. I think that's everything. I mean, now I'm here. That's how I got into tech and programming at GitHub. And well, I guess I skipped a couple companies, but now I work at GitHub.
Awesome. You're amazing. There's nothing else to say other than that. Anyone that's out there that's interested in anything about any of this should follow Eileen too on Twitter. Her handle on Twitter is Eileen Coates, and that handle is pretty much everywhere too. And if you have any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A, and Eileen will answer some of them.
There's one, let's see. Any advice for a Rails newbie like myself? I skipped this is my favorite part with Rails. Like, you look at Rails and you think, oh, well, like there's all these smart people who are contributing to it, so it must be perfect. And when I found that first bug in Rails, like my first thought was like, must be this way for a reason. Like, I don't know, I'm not smarter than the 12 people who run this
probably
show.
Doing something wrong. Right?
Yeah. But then it turned out that I wasn't wrong. And so I think that like always going into something with or I was wrong. Rails was broken. Going into like problems with a curiosity of like always questioning whether or not it actually is working the way it should. For like, and also that's good in like any programming stuff. Like, if you like write code and you write a test and it passes the first time, you should be worried. I mean, unless it was a really simple test, but like there's like been times that John and I have written code together and then we run the test and it doesn't fail. And I'm like, there's no way that this is not broken. And not because we're like, don't know what we're doing, but because like you get stuff wrong. And so you should always kind of like think about what are the ways this can break? What am I not testing? What am I not thinking about? It's too easy to be like, let me just deploy this to like production and then it breaks and you're like, I don't know why. And a lot of times if you spend time thinking about like, what are all the things that can go wrong, which sounds kind of dark, but it's not that. Think about all the things that can go wrong and then like apply that to all the code that you write. Let's see, question 2, what's the next bug you're trying to solve? There's that migrations ordering bug. If you have multiple databases and you run the migrations, which migrations are like how you change the database in Rails. So you write a file and you run it, and that like adds a column or deletes a column or adds a table, deletes a table, all that good stuff. There's a bug in multiple databases where, because they run in the order the databases are defined in your configuration, they can actually run out of order. And then you like could delete a table before you run the migration to update the other table in the other database. So John and I are trying to fix that. But actually we have a fix, we just haven't finished it.
We're like that close. Like we have the fix, we just haven't written all the tests to prove that the fix is right yet.
Yeah. Okay. Do you feel that you had to work harder to get noticed? I'm going to assume that means as a woman in tech. Yes and no. I do invisible work by default, like anything like upgrade work on Rails, work on security, performance. I call it invisible work because a customer is never going to like send you an email and be like, oh, I love that you upgraded Rails. It's just never going to happen. And it's also the kind of work where like people notice when something goes wrong. And so like if you upgrade Rails 100 times and it never causes a bug, no one's going to like say anything. But if you upgrade Rails one time, like 101, and that one causes a bug in production, everyone's going to be like, oh my God, deploying Rails to production is risky and scary, even though like 5 people yesterday deployed to production other non-upgrade stuff that caused incidents. It's just the nature of the work. So I think that like it's a little bit harder for me to determine whether or not other people were more visible, because like in this kind of work, you're not visible, and I work very hard to make it visible. Whereas I think a lot of times people will be like, oh, upgrading is not interesting, so there's no reason to write a post about it. Whereas like I am just going to write a post every time we do an upgrade, be like, you have to read this because this is important work. I also like started by default, like as soon as I realized I didn't want to work at the agency that I was working at, because like, and there's a lot of reasons why, like we were doing like, you'd be like working on a project and the next day they'd be like, oh, okay, everybody drop everything. We have to build this website for this client for this event. And I was just like, but I wanted to finish this other thing. So you never really got to deep dive into stuff. And at that company, I did feel a lot like I was really trying to like be more respected. But that might've been more of an age thing, because I wasn't that, but we were all like, those of us who were in the doing the work were very young. So I think that might have been more of an age problem in that case. But like from that, I like started, I was like, okay, I'm going to make myself visible. I'm going to have Twitter. I'm going to Stack Overflow. I'm going to like use GitHub. I'm going to do anything and write blog posts. And so like I wrote blog posts and tweeted about them like very early in my Rails career. I actually wrote and it's not up anymore because I got tired of running my own Rails server. I actually wrote a Rails app to write the blog posts about Rails. And so I deployed the Rails app, and then I would add features and then write blog posts about those. So it was like building something that could dog food my own visibility. And so I, from the beginning, defaulted to make myself visible, which maybe I learned from like the art industry, because like you don't get noticed in the art industry without being like very visible and selling yourself. And it could be like can be really hard to do that because a lot of people feel like they're bragging or whatever, or you feel like, oh, no one needs to know about database performance, like everyone knows it. But that's not true. Like there's new people joining every day who never read your blog post about taking the database down. And so, and like also like no one's going to read content from 2014, so you might as well write a new one, so that like when someone switches to like on Google, I always switch to like past year, because I don't want to see anything from 2014. Like it's not applicable anymore, especially like in this industry. So if you've got an interesting post, like write the post, tweet about your stuff, although Twitter is less fun than it used to be. But More questions. Okay. You made a big pivot in undergrad. How are you able to make that kind of pivot, and what kept you motivated to continue to code? I don't think it was a conscious decision. I really just was like, whatever job will work. But I mean, also like this was the recession, right? So the Great Recession of 2008, 7 to 9, like everybody was willing to take whatever job came up first. And so like our jobs were like not going to be that available. And I also was painfully aware that the print industry was dying at the same time. And it was like clear to me that the school like wasn't keeping up with that. And so I think that like, because I could see that web was going to be the way to go, like, and I liked it. It wasn't like I pursued a career, pivoted to a career that I was like, meh, maybe whatever. Like I really enjoyed coding like from day one. So I think that it didn't feel like a pivot to me. It felt like an extension of what I was already doing. And also like I did enough of being an assistant for photographers that I realized it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. They were all very talented, but you have to work in someone's shadow for like 10 years before you could be like getting your own jobs. And that's just, and you had to like move to the city, and I wasn't going to do that. So for everyone, I live on 2 hours north of the city, New York City. This is how you know you're from New York. You say the city, which is such a rude thing that New Yorkers do. So 2 hours north of New York City. So there's not like a lot of tech jobs around here, which is why I work remote. One of the reasons. I mean, GitHub is remote, so I work remote with GitHub, but I've actually been remote for 8 years at various companies. So more questions. About testing your code, is it required now a day as junior developer? Oh, should we start learning now? Yeah, you should test your code. Always test your code. I don't like, you'll like when you start learning about testing, like you might hear about TDD. I personally do not subscribe to TDD. I think it's a useful tool for like learning certain things. That's test-driven development. It's where you like write the test first, so it's failing, and then you write the code, and then you make the code pass, then you make the code fail. Then I don't know. It can be a good tool for like certain kinds of testing, but I'm a much more visual person. Like I need to see the thing break in the console or in production before I want to write the test for it, because like then you might not know the failure scenarios. But it's sort of like, it depends on how you like to write code. Some companies are like very into TDD, and you might just have to do that because that's what they expect. But I've never worked anywhere that does TDD, and I don't personally do it. But it's not like I don't not do it because it's bad. It's not my style. It's just a different style. But you should always write tests, because you're not magic. I'm not magic. Don't trust yourself so much that you don't write tests. And also, if you're working on an application with someone else and like you don't write tests and they change the code and then it breaks your stuff, like how would they know? The tests tell them like they broke the expected behavior. Okay. Well, okay, there are so many questions. I don't think I can answer all of these.
Yeah, I've been taking a couple out. If someone asks whether Eileen likes Rails or Django, it's gonna be Rails. I'm gonna archive that question. But if there's anyone's if there are anyone's in here that you think are that speak to you or you want to answer, and then I think we'll have to just archive the rest.
All right. What's your take on the future of Ruby and Ruby on Rails as we move from desktops to mobile? Will this language and framework be relevant in 10 years? Yeah, I don't really believe in like dying languages, especially like I've seen a resurgence of Rails being used again for apps, because everyone went down the whole like JavaScript bloated path and then was like, wow, this sucks. So so you haven't really used Ruby on Rails yet, but like it just makes the development experience so nice. Like it packages everything together for you that you need so that you can focus on like your product or whatever you're building, and it's just so much more of an enjoyable experience than being like, oh my God, how do I like set up a database again, or like download a billion packages. And that's not like, that's the ecosystem of Node and JavaScript, and that's fine for some people, but like sometimes you don't want to use that. But I also like don't see us moving from desktop to mobile permanently. Like I don't enjoy, like there's certain things I will not do on my phone. I will not make calendar invites on my phone or change them. For some reason, I always mess it up on my phone. Got to use my laptop. The size of the screen, the hardware. I mean, I guess phones can get to the point where the hardware is the same as a laptop, but I just like it. I don't know. I don't see desktops going away for certain kinds of things that we like to do on the web, that we don't do on the mobile. And I actually think like some apps like really should get a better web experience, like Instagram. Like, are you kidding? Why is the web experience so bad? I don't understand. And like they still don't have an iPad app.
Yeah, it's still like the weird iPhone app, like the direct iPhone app.
I just like, I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. So no, I think like I actually think the also, because there's so much investment in Rails and Ruby, like Shopify is heavily investing in Ruby, GitHub invests in Ruby, Basecamp's not going anywhere anytime soon, and they built the thing, Rails, not Ruby. And then Heroku for Ruby, that's where Mats is employed. I don't know. I don't think it's going anywhere, and I think it's like actively improving. And I think the more people we have contributing to like improving Rails, like the better, and Ruby, the better like it's going to be for us in the long haul. All right. How much more time do I have?
I mean, you can
No
take
time.
as long as you want, but maybe we should.
Well,
just
no,
do
I don't want to take
one more
here.
question.
Okay.
Actually, I think one that might be interesting is, unless you want to pick one, unless you have.
No,
one.
you pick one, because I can't read and talk at the same time.
I was thinking, does GitHub use new things like Hotwire, for example? I think you would have a good answer on this because a lot of the work you do is kind of for this.
Yeah, we're not using Hotwire yet, although I have like sort of pushed for it, but it's not my team that does front end stuff. So it's a little separate at GitHub, the way the front end back end, like they're Rails, but the teams are different and they like have different goals and stuff. I did get them in early access to HTML over the wire, hoping that we would use it, but I'm not going to push for that because I don't write front end code. So but we do use other new stuff like
I'd say like one of the biggest benefits of the work that Eileen is doing and has done in the past to keep us on recent Rails is that we're making changes to Rails, we're making it better, and that we can use those things like immediately. And if you like let your stuff fall behind, then you can't do that, right?
Yeah, upgrading is so important. I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a second about upgrades. Okay, you're gonna work at companies and they're gonna be like, upgrades aren't important, our product is more important. But guess what happens when you don't upgrade? Your product falls apart because your foundation is weak. Upgrades are the most important thing. Upgrade when there's a new version, not 7 years later, because like GitHub's upgrade from like 3.2 to whatever we're on now, main, but like the 3.2 to 6 was very expensive and very painful, and it didn't have to be. It was like a choice the company made like many years ago to not upgrade. And I think we learned a lot of lessons from that. And like the reasons was like, oh, we have these other product stuff that's more important. And like, there's always gonna be product stuff to build. So not that, if you build a company, make sure you upgrade. Don't let anyone tell you upgrades aren't important. If you have to, link them to my talks where I paint some bleak pictures of not upgrading.
Security issues are like discovered every day.
Yeah.
Do
you want to be like 7 versions behind when there's a security patch, but like they didn't write a patch for your version because like we thought that nobody was using it anymore? And a lot of people will be like, yeah, we could write the patch and add it ourselves, but like it's bad because you don't know, like Rails is never, like when we release security CVEs, we don't tell you how to exploit it. Only we know, like the Rails core team. So like, why, like writing your own patches is super dangerous because you don't know all the holes in that. And a lot of times we don't patch those old versions because like, we're like, I don't know, we haven't used that in 7 years. So it's not getting a patch. So anyway.
I archived a bunch of questions. I'm sorry to anyone that asked a question that we didn't have time for. If you want to answer this last one, you can. And if you don't want, that's okay too.
What is your opinion on a career path of software development test engineer versus software development developer versus site reliability engineer? I mean, I think it depends on what you like to do. Like if you site reliability, you're doing DevOps, like system admin and stuff. You're writing deploy scripts, writing monitoring so the sites, so that you can like test the site is up, but you're not writing product code. I don't write product code either, but like there's sort of like a weird in between where like I'm not site reliability, but I'm not product. Software engineer, a lot of times you're gonna be writing product code or backend code, or you might be an infrastructure software engineer where you're like building CI tools or the developer experience versus the actual product. And then test engineers, you're only writing tests. So, I mean, I guess if you really like writing tests, that's cool. I don't know if this is inappropriate, but you're going to get paid less. So you can go for test engineer and like, but it's not, companies just don't pay test engineers as well as software engineers. So if that's like something that,
and although it's possible, a lot of times test engineer isn't part of the path into normal engineer,
right?
More like if a junior engineer would be the path into, non-junior engineer.
Yeah, so I think it's actually easier to move from software engineer to site reliability and back and forth than it is to move from test engineer to software engineer. And that's just because you're not getting the production code experience. You're writing tests, you're doing click testing, Q&A, writing Selenium tests. And like, that doesn't mean that you can't find a job that you get paid just as well as someone else. It's just, I just usually see it at like, it just usually doesn't seem to be at the same level, like the same pay level as software engineer. Maybe I think that should probably change because like testing is really important, but, and it also like a lot of companies like blur the line between like test engineer as like I write Selenium tests that like do or like I do end-to-end testing or whatever, and the like click testing. And so a lot of times when like companies haven't figured out how to like define that role well, you end up doing like grunt work, I think more. But I've also never been a test engineer. This is just sort of what I've observed from the outside of how we don't have any test engineers at GitHub. So what we used to, and I felt like they ended up doing a lot of click testing, which is like, everyone should be click testing their own product features that they're adding. But then I also think that we should have a better, I don't know. There maybe should be some test infrastructure engineers, but I don't know. We kind of like all own it. And that's not to say like we're always doing it right. I don't know. Every company does things differently. So
yeah, there are a lot of approaches. I think we're out of questions. Okay. I want to emphasize one more time for everyone that's on here. I've been programming for a very long time, and I can say with absolute certainty that Eileen is one of, if not the best developers that you will ever meet. If you enjoyed what she said here, you can follow her over on Twitter at Eileen Codes, EILEEN Codes. And I'll also send it out in the email that I send right after the class. Thank you again for being here. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm sorry for everyone whose questions I didn't get to answer. I don't know if there's a place to answer more later, but John can tell me about that. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks for having me. Bye. Enjoy your first day of Ruby and Rails.
Okay, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I think it's an exciting introduction to Rails, especially because Eileen is just such a central figure in the Rails community. Probably years from now, you're going to get into Rails more. You're going to have maybe a career in Rails, and then you're going to understand a little bit of why it is so meaningful and why I'm taking so much time to stress why it's important that Eileen was here, because she truly is like the best. So, okay, let's get into it. Let's start with the homework from yesterday. Okay, I'm going to bring up the homework from yesterday. Just give me 1 second, and then we'll go through it. Okay, did you all have a good time with the homework? I know there were some concerns. Hopefully we're going to resolve those concerns right now, though, when we go through the homework. So exercise 1 is to implement a class to store information about a business. Okay, so we know that we can just start without even reading anymore. We can start by creating a class to store information about a business. So that's just class business and end. It's an empty, sure. Sorry, and thank you. Okay, so class business end. We know that that's the first thing that we need. So we may as well just go create that empty class. Okay, so the next thing that we are supposed to do is that it's supposed to have an initializer that should take in a name and location. So for us, that means that we want to have an initializer that takes in name and location. It doesn't say anymore, so we're not going to do anymore. The next line says ability to get the name and location back out. So there's many ways that we can do that. Like we've seen before, we could have something like def name at name, or def location at location. But the easiest way by far is to use something we learned yesterday, which is attr reader. So I've attr reader name location. And then in order to make that work correctly in my initialize method, I have to set those instance variables. So when the thing gets created, I'm setting at name to name, at location to out location, or sorry, to location, and then getting these two methods for name and location. So we can actually test that if we want to. We can say John's is business.new, John's place, and it's in New Jersey. And we can do puts John's.name and puts John's.location. So let's run that. Things are running a little slow. It's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point. While it decides what it's going to do, we'll keep going. So just trust me that this is probably going to work. Next, we want to define a method called hasFood that returns false. So that seems pretty easy. HasFood, and it returns false. And remember, we don't have to write return false here. We're just implicit return. So when we write false, that's the same as saying return false. Because remember, the last line in any method specifies the return value of the method. Okay, I'm going to figure out why my code's not running. Okay. Okay, so John's place in New Jersey. Okay, so this is exercise 1. We have to find a business class with a name method, a location method, and a hasFood method that always returns false. Is this clear to anyone? If there's any questions about exercise 1, let's address those right now. I also want to point out that we have technically on our original schedule, there is one more day allocated for Ruby. So I'll spend as much time on this stuff as you want. We just have to, I want to keep going because I want to buy more times for other topics, but I'll do whatever you want because we technically, I've already allocated for one extra day of Ruby. So what attr reader does, to answer the question from the chat, attr reader says, I want to define a method and I want to return the instance variable of the same name as the method. So when I write this add a reader name comma location, that is the same thing as writing these two methods, one that returns name and one that returns location. Okay, the next question is, what's the deal with the colon symbol before the variable's name and add a reader? Yeah, there needs to be something here because remember, add a reader is just another method call. It's a call to a class method called add a reader. So inside of it, it needs to pass the name of something, and you, I guess, could pass those as strings or symbols, but the way to do it is with symbols. So it's the symbol name of the thing that you want to actually create the methods for. Next question is, why did I not use adder accessor instead of reader? Yeah, so you can think of adder accessor is the same thing as writing adder reader and adder writer. And the reason that I chose to not use adder accessor is because I don't need to have a way to set the name or set the location. In the instructions, the only thing that was specified was the ability to get the name and location. So because I only wanted one, that is what I used. Okay, the next question is, can you go over adder writer one more time if possible? Yeah, so just to drive it home, adder reader is def location at location. That's what you get with adder reader. Adder writer is def location equals location at location equals location, or we can even say value here. Okay, so when you write adder writer of location, you get a method called location equals, essentially is the setter. And when you write adder reader of location, you get a getter, which is a method with the same name as the instance variable that returns the value of the instance variable. And of course, when you use adder accessor, you get both of them. Because again, adder accessor is the same as adder reader plus adder writer. Next question is, can you repeat not to use return with false? Yeah, in normal, like other programming languages, you would write something like return false, right? This is pretty normal to write. So the way that Ruby works is, let's say that you ignore this for now, because I'm going to use it in a second. Let's say that you have a method. So this is a method, right? And the method is orange, and the method does a few things. So in a normal programming language, one of these things will be to write return. In Ruby, what happens is whatever the last thing is the thing that gets returned. Okay, so the implicit return means that whatever the value of the last line inside that method, that's the thing that'll get returned. So when I write return false, that's the same as writing false. So this line where I write false literally just means return false. Does that clear it up, Jada? Okay, the next question is there a reason you'd want to use adder writer instead of adder accessor? I can't say why you'd want to be able to edit a variable, but then you wouldn't want to be able to edit but not read. Yeah, there are cases. There are cases definitely where you want to be able to set something and not be able to get something. For example, in this class for business, let's just say, I might not want to have the location be accessible outside, but I might specifically want you to be able to set the location. I would say it's not very common, but it is needed in some cases. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but we'll definitely encounter them. I would say with programming, a lot of times we go with the kind of principle of like least access. So you only want to give the things that are actually accessible. Yeah, banking is a good example of maybe someplace you would want an adder reader, but not an adder writer. So you should not be able to write your balance, but you do want to be able to see your balance. You might be able to write in information about your dependents, but not be able to get that information necessarily back out. Next question from Felipe is why you always use the word method and never the word function? Because when you're speaking about functions that exist within the within a class, they're called methods. In Ruby, they're all just called methods. So the reason I'm using that term is because that's the term that you're going to hear when you're talking to other developers. Functions are typically used in non-object oriented language when you're talking about a non-object oriented language. So we use method here. Yashil, if you can do me a favor and put it in the Q&A in the future, that would be helpful. But is there a reason why question marks placed at the end of the method has food? No, there's not. It is a convention that indicates to the caller that this method returns something that is true or false. It's just a special method name. Just like any other name, you can have question marks at the end of a method. Okay, on to exercise 2. Exercise 2 says that we want to have a subclass that represents a certain type of business called a restaurant. Okay, we can do that. So remember we learned about subclasses yesterday. Restaurant is a subclass business. And we can actually do owls. Restaurant.new owls pizzeria in New York. And puts John's has food. Someone said font. I'm guessing you want the font larger. It does make it harder to organize. Fonts. Okay, I'm going to keep the font. If someone wants the font bigger, you can say that, but it does make it harder to put more code on the screen, which is going to be even more of a problem later. So I will output this. Okay, so we have John's, which is a business, has food is false, as Owl's, which is a restaurant, has food is false. So the next part of the exercise that says that we want to have has food return true for restaurants. So we can do that. We can just do here, and we can implement has food again on restaurant. So remember, the way that method lookup works is that first it looks on the class that you're directly on, then it looks at any modules that were directly included into that class, then it looks at any superclasses. And I was thinking about this last night, and I was thinking that a really nice way to think about it is like, remember those clear transparencies that they use in class? I want you to think of it like that, where essentially you take the superclass and you have all of the methods that exist for the superclass. And then I want you to layer a transparency on top of that that is the other class. So you think of it like when I defined has food on restaurant, it actually covers up the has food implementation that was on business. You can the term that we normally use is called shadowing. So the restaurant's implementation of has food covers up or shadows the has food implementation on the superclass business. So when I run this now, you'll see that Owls does not have food, but sorry, John's does not have food, but Owls does. Just like a screen projector, just like the transparencies that you use on a screen projector. Okay, I'm going to pause again for questions on exercise 2, and then we'll keep going. And while I do that, I'm going to look up a couple notes that I wrote. Okay, cool. Let's go to exercise 3. Yeah, I think one thing that's part of this is like, it's going to make more sense when I do it. The way that you can cement that knowledge is watch me do it and then go back and do it yourself too. Paul Senior says, maybe bad question. Does Ruby have method overloading? You can think of this as method overloading. So you're defining a method that is replacing another method. If you're thinking about method overloading in the traditional sense, the answer is no, because Ruby is not statically typed. Anonymous attendee says, can you scroll to the bottom of the code? Yes, I can. Anonymous attendee says, what about initializer? What is the preference? So I'm not sure what you're asking, but it works the same way. So remember, initialize is just another method. Unlike other languages where there are things like constructors, there are no constructors here. So there's an initialize method. Remember yesterday what I was saying is that if you looked at the implementation of new, the thing that we're using to new things up, which again is just another method, it's probably something like object equals allocate new object, and then object.initialize, and then return object. So this is how new works. First, it creates some space, then it calls the method called initialize, and then it returns the object. So the only thing special about initialize is that it happens to be the method that new calls. So new is not special in any way, and because of that, it works the same way. First, it'll try to call it on the class, then on the module, then on the superclass. That is correct, Cole, but the modules work at every level. So you have like the class, the modules directly in the class, the superclass, the modules directly in the superclass, all the way up to the top. And if you're interested more in that precedent order, you can look it up. The next question is, does Ruby have method signatures? No. The method signature is just the name. That's it. Ernest says, it appears that module and class are the same, except class needs initialization. That is almost right. The real difference between modules and classes is that classes can have instances and modules cannot. So a class is the definition of something. An object is one of those things. Remember, like this is the definition of what it means to be a business. John's is a business. And then a module is like an add-on, or what we called yesterday, and use the term that's normally used, a mix-in. It's some added behavior that you can add to a class. Think about like another transparency, except it's a transparency that you can never get a new one of. It just adds functionality. You can never make a new one of them. They additionally don't live in the class hierarchy. So the class hierarchy we were talking about yesterday with animals and maybe walking animals descends from that. Modules don't have any hierarchy. They're just a collection of methods. That's all they are. Okay, so exercise 3, we are going to create a mix-in or a module. It says here that the module is going to be called has ratings. And this module should add the ability to take in the ratings of a business. So this includes being able to take in a rating, as well as a method called average rating to return the average rating, being sure to account for the case where there are 0 ratings. And yes, you can have multiple modules. So I'm gonna just outline what I want to add. I want to have an add rating method that takes in a rating. And then I want to have a average rating method that will return a number or something, some type of number, right? We'll even just say number. Some number will come out of this average rating method. And then because it's a module, what we can do is we can grab this, we can go into business, and we can include has ratings. So just by writing include has ratings, all of a sudden business and restaurant both get an add rating method and an average rating method. So what's cool about that is we've taken the entire idea of what it means to have ratings and we've bundled it up in this class. So now automatically we can go to any object that we create and we can just write include has ratings, and we've given it the ability to take in ratings. So let's go implement this. The way that we'll implement it is I'm going to start by writing some code to test out the behavior. So we'll do owls.add rating 5. We'll do alice.add rating 2. And then we'll do johns.add rating 4. And then what we're expecting is owl's rating is owl's average rating. And we can even write should be, and we're guessing that the answer here should be 3.5, right? Because it's 5 plus 2 divided by 2. And we can do the same for John's. So let's just write the same code here. We'll say that John's should be 4 and like that. Okay. So, okay, we implemented add rating, but we didn't do anything inside of it. So right now we're seeing Al's rating is and then nothing. So let's go just implement as ratings. Also, I want to note that like the thing I'm doing here is testing. So we're not using a testing library or anything, but this is how you test. You kind of write some assumptions about how things should work and then make sure your code does those things. So first we need somewhere to store the ratings. So we will make an instance variable called ratings. And then every time that we have a rating added, we will add it into that ratings array. So one thing that's a little confusing here is if I do this, if I write ratings equals empty array, every time that you add a new rating, we're going to erase all of the other ratings because remember, equals doesn't pay any care to whether or not ratings has already been initialized. So because of that, we actually need to write if not ratings, or you can write unless ratings. Okay. Or you can write if, maybe this is an even clearer way to write it, if ratings.nil. So you can read this as make the instance variable ratings equal to an empty array if it's not already set. You can't use empty. I guess you can use empty if you want to. Empty would also be fine. And then add the rating into the ratings array. And then average rating will be ratings.average. Look what it says. Oh no, there's no average method. Okay, so what is an average? An average is the sum of things divided by the length of those things. So we can do that. Ratings.sum divided by ratings.length. Okay, so we're going to see an issue here that I think a lot of the code submissions that I did see have, which is that we're seeing 3 and 4 come out. And the reason that 3 and 4 are coming out is because when you divide a whole number by a whole number, the answer has to be a whole number because we're talking about integers only, remember? So in order to get this to work correctly, we will need some type of a way to fix that. So the easiest way to fix that is to put a 2f on the end here. This is a little confusing. I will talk about it in a moment. But I can just talk about it now. So what it does is it takes the ratings length and it converts it to what's called a float. So the important thing here is that, again, if you divide a whole number by a whole number, you're going to get what is called another integer. So because it has to be an integer, 3 divided by 4 will technically equal 0. Now, if you did 3.0 divided by 4.0, then Ruby says, oh, okay, you're okay getting back a number with decimal places, then it's going to return 0.75. Okay, so what the 2f does is it essentially takes the second number, the denominator in this case, and it converts it into a 0.0 version of itself. It turns it into what's called a float. So then the division works correctly because we're taking an integer and we're dividing it into a float. Okay, if you don't get the float thing, it doesn't matter. It's okay. There are other ways to solve this problem. I don't know if this will make more sense to people. Maybe it will. So take all the ratings and then divide them by whatever the normal ratings is times 1.0. And times 1.0 essentially turns the second piece of this into a floating point number. I know that we didn't cover this, so if you just wrote ratings.length, that's also fine. You'll get a perfectly fine answer. But if you want to be able to represent half numbers, this is how you would do it. Ratings.length 2f. Okay. So if you didn't solve that problem, the 2F part, do not worry about it. It's not really important. It's not important for the problem, but just know that like when you divide an integer into an integer, there is a lossiness that kind of happens there. The float is like a double, yes. Okay, so another question. Sure, I can try. I'm just going to drop it in there blindly. I'm not going to like try to fix anything about it. So because I want to keep moving, but okay. So another thing that is being asked here by Caitlin is there a reason not to store the ratings array in the business class initializer? There is a reason. And the reason is because if I stored the ratings array in here, it would work. So you could do something like this, ratings equal empty array. The problem is that now, in order for a class to be able to use ratings, it has to include has ratings, and it also has to make sure to set the ratings array to equal empty array. So the problem is that now you have two things that new classes wanting this behavior have to know to do in order to use this behavior. But ideally, you don't have that. You don't have two things. So by taking all of the information related to @ratings and encapsulating it in this module has ratings, I've essentially taken the full responsibility of ratings and put it into that module. So I can drop it in anywhere and I can use it with no problem. So while it works, it is not, I would say, as good of a practice to do that. Does it matter where on the screen you type the module, above or below the class? It does not. Well, actually, let's verify that, because I think in this case it maybe does. Yeah, so has ratings needs to be above, because at the point where class business is run, this is kind of evaluated in order. So when it gets to here, it's going to say, oh, include has ratings. What's has ratings? I don't know what it is. Then it's gonna fall apart. So make sure that your module is declared above the classes that use them. And eventually we'll solve that problem by moving things into separate files, which we're going to see once we start moving into Rails. Anonymous attendee says, what does @ratings left arrow rating mean? What it means is add. So if I look at Ruby array, and I look at the documentation for array, you can see here that it is append, pushes the given object to the end of the array. Okay, so that's how you put something into an array. Okay, cool. Another thing I saw people do, which I think is actually pretty neat, is they implemented add rating a little bit differently. I'm going to cover it just because I think it is interesting. So what they did is they said, okay, I'm going to say that the total score is equal to 0 if the score is nil. And I'll say that the ratings count is equal to 0 if ratings count is nil. And then what they did when they add rating is they did score equals score plus rating. And they did @ratings count equals ratings count plus 1. So what they got by doing this is now this can change to be @score divided by ratings count.2f. So this is just another approach on the same problem. And instead of keeping all of the ratings and then figuring out how to sum them afterward, what they did instead is they kept a total score and a total number of ratings. So that's the two pieces of information that you need in order to get the average rating back out. Okay. Yeah, it is cool. And a good reminder that there are multiple ways to solve every problem. It's a completely different way to solve the problem, but just as valid as the other one. Another thing I wanted to note before I get into the kind of the meat of today's course is I wanted to say that if you're, I'm giving a lot of the feedback that I give on Slack just because it's easier to reach people. So one, if you want feedback, be there because it will make it easier for me to give feedback. But another thing that I'm noticing is that a lot of times the usernames on Slack don't line up with the usernames on GitHub. So I have to do some extra work to put the two together. So if you can, and you want feedback and you want to make it easy for me, I know some of you have your GitHub username essentially in your name on Slack. That would make it easy. Also, if your name is like the same as your GitHub username, then just ignore this piece altogether. Okay, who's ready to do Rails? Or who's ready to look at Rails and determine if it's good or not? Okay, so we are going to start in on some Rails stuff. And I want to start by saying that a lot of full-time developers that I know cannot set up, they're full-time developers working in Rails every day, and they cannot set up a Rails app from nothing. So don't be hard on yourself if this part is confusing. This part is bound to be confusing, but there really is just no way to have you learn without doing this. Because you're not going into a company with a giant Rails app that's already set up. You are going into making your own thing right now. So we're gonna take some time to get it set up, but don't be hard on yourself. It is confusing. It's gonna be okay. Before we get started, I need to talk also about the typical client server architecture that exists on the web today. And that's actually what I have down here. So when we talk about a client server architecture, we talk about the user is the client. So this is you out in the world using a website, and your web browser is the thing by which you're using to make the requests. Then you're headed over the internet and you connect to a server on the other side. And that probably makes, this diagram probably makes sense, I think. You're a user, you call over the internet, and then a server receives your request for some page. It figures out what to send back to you, and then it sends it back across the internet. And a lot of times in a typical arrangement like this, there's also a database involved. So the server, in order to get the answer for the thing that you want, is talking to this database. Okay, so this is the picture that needs to be in your head for how a client server application typically works. This is what it looks like at its most simple. So Rails, in relation to Ruby, is the thing that's going to allow you to build the server. So you're going to write the server code in Ruby, but Ruby by itself is not a web server. So like, you notice that we've been writing a bunch of Ruby for the past 4 or 5 days, and we haven't written anything about like putting together a web page or how to respond to web requests or anything like that. And that's because Ruby is not a web server, and it's also not, it doesn't have functionality built in to be able to answer web requests. So what Rails is it gives it the ability to answer web requests. It is what's called a web framework. And it is a library for Ruby specifically built for building websites, and not like normal websites, not websites with just like HTML that like look nice, but like real websites that do things, websites where you can type in information and have it persisted in a database and then be able to pull that information back out. So Rails is the thing that runs on the server over here. And it's actually so much more than that, because it's actually manages the HTML files. It manages responding with the right status codes to the browser. It manages interacting with the database via a layer called Active Record, which we're going to talk a lot about and Eileen talked about earlier. It manages how to organize the files in your repository, things like that. And it manages all of that via a thing. Actually, I'm going to use this piece of the diagram to draw the thing. It manages that via a thing called MVC. That stands for model, and then view, and then controller. Now, when I get read MVC, I get a little upset because I feel like it actually should go this way. MCV. So model is how you interact with your database. Okay. This is database. It's the part of Rails where you're going to talk to your database. Controller is how you decide what to do when a certain user visits a certain page. And view is the part where you decide what it's going to look like. And I'm only saying these three things and pointing it out now because when we build our Rails application, these three things are like kind of separated. There's a layer called the model layer that involves talking to the database, a controller layer that involves deciding what to do, and a view layer that decides ultimately what the thing that the user will see looks like. So you don't have to do a deep dive into MVC or model view controller, but know that Rails is a model view controller framework. So if it seems like there are a lot of things that you have to learn, that's kind of on purpose, and it's there to keep these three concerns separate from each other. Dimple, we are going to cover that in just a minute, and it's going to be fun. Okay, so as was just alluded to in the question, we are going to be creating a Rails app, and we're going to do it right now. We skipped the break. I'm sorry if anyone really wanted a break. So someone asks, is this along the lines of monolithic versus decoupled code? It is not. So Rails is used for building monolithic Rails applications. What that means is that there's essentially one server. That server is all of this stuff. This is the Rails server. So it is monolithic at its core. What it just means is that model, view, and controller are three separate concepts in Rails, all three of which we're going to learn. The view is HTML, the controller is Ruby, and the model is also Ruby. Okay. So one more thing, and then we're going to install Rails. The last thing is I have to talk about databases for a second. So I have to tell you what a database is, because if I don't tell you what a database is, you are not going to understand basically anything. So we have a database. Database, I want you to think of it like this. There are a series of columns in the database. So a database might store something like the name and the age. Think of it like a spreadsheet, right? And then inside the database, there are also rows. So it'll say something like John, and it will say something like the age, no. And this is how it works. So these are the columns, name, age, and these are the rows. So a row is this collection of things. And then the second row would be something like Kate and 34 again. Okay, so this is a row. This is a row. This is a column. Really important to understand this. And this is also a column. Okay, so some things to point out that this is how a database works. Rows, columns, column names, and this big red box is what we call a table. Okay, it is exactly a spreadsheet. That is exactly what a database is. That is 100% what it is. It's a spreadsheet. It's a matrix of information. It's just a bunch of fields that describe something. So the table has a name. In this case, it would be something like people. And then inside of there, there'd be individual rows representing each of the people. And there would be columns representing each of the pieces of information about an individual person. And what you get by putting information into a database is that you can ask the database questions. So once I've put all of this in here, I can say, hey, database, how many people are there? And boom, answer is going to come back instantly because it knows how many rows there are. Then I could say, hey, database, give me all of the people whose age are 34. And it can quickly answer that question too. Just like an Excel spreadsheet you could do by filtering only the places where age is 34 and returning only those rows. That's what a database is. If anyone ever talks about a database, this is a database. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a database inside of our code space. I have done this before, but I've never done it live. So if something goes wrong, We will figure it out. So let's start by installing a database. And what we're going to do to install a database is we're going to type apt install Sqlite 3. Sorry, Sql Lite. And we have to write sudo at the front. Okay. This is just kind of table stakes. You do this once, you're never going to have to do it again. So we're going to, if you want to do it now, or you can watch the video, probably watch the video or whatever you want. I don't care. So then you're going to see a bunch of these progress indicators fly by. And what that's doing right now is it's going out to the big computer in the sky or whatever, and it's downloading a database called Sqlite 3. So there are many different databases, just like there are many of everything in the world. There's a database called MySQL, which Eileen talked about earlier a little bit. There's a database called Postgres. Those are all fine. What's special about Sqlite 3 is it is a database that runs on the computer. So it runs local to your computer. You don't have to have a separate server. And it stores its database in just a file. So we're going to use that here. If you want, in the future, I can show how to use other things, but here we're going to use Sqlite. And you can start Sqlite by typing Sqlite. So I'm going to type some things. These are not things you need to know, but I just want to really nail. So to get to the terminal, you click the terminal button. And you want sudo apt install Sqlite with, I don't think you want Sqlite 3, you just want Sqlite, but whichever one works, they're both the same. I'm gonna execute a couple of statements to talk to the database so you can see how you talk to a database. And really, I want to drive home this graph by doing that. You will not have to do this. Rails will do this for you. So do not learn anything about the type. I just want you to understand how it works. So this is called Sql. So we're going to create table, and we'll call that table people, and it will have a name, and it will have an age. Let's say that's okay. It's not giving me what I want. Create table people. Second. See, this is like Rails does this, so it does it so much for you that even remembering how it works is a challenge sometimes. Create table people. I feel like I nailed it. I don't know. That looks right to me. Sorry, 1 second. I'm missing something. Maybe it's working. Okay, let's try to insert something. Insert into people. Values. John 4. Okay, yeah, it is working. So check out what I did here. I created a table called people. So that's like creating this red box. And I said that that table should have 2 columns inside of it. It should have a name column and it should have an age column. It's very similar to what we had here, a name and an age column. Okay. And then I ran select from people and it returned nothing because there are no people in the database. Okay. Then I inserted a row into people where the name is John and the age is 34. And now I'm selecting from people and it's giving me John 34. So let's insert some more rows so that things get a little bit more interesting. Like I promised, let's insert Kate. Let's insert Abby. Let's insert Jeremiah, and Jeremiah will make 24 instead. Okay, now watch this. Select star from people. Okay, so these are all the people in my database. And now I can say select star from people where age is 34. So now look, the database gave me an answer that excluded Jeremiah because age is not 34. So there's this language that I can now write these queries in. I can ask the database questions, and it's going to very quickly be able to give me back the answer, even if there are millions and millions of rows. Okay, if you want to exit from SQLite, you can do Control D. So Control on your keyboard and D. And that's a pretty good thing to do because watch when I go back into it. Now I'm going to run that again. And you'll see, okay, yeah, so in this case, there are no more people because we weren't storing that information, but normally that information would be stored in a file so that when we come back to it, it's still there. Okay, so this is just to show you, you don't need to know SQL, but what this is going to show you is that the thing I just showed you on this view works the way I say. There's a language called SQL that allows you to write these things called queries, where you can insert a bunch of information and then you can ask questions about that thing. So you can say where age is 34 and where name starts with A, or where age is greater than 24 and name ends with E. Okay, I'm going to spend some time answering questions, and then we really have to keep moving because we are going to go create a Rails application. Okay. Felipe says, does Rails use SQL? The answer is yes. So we are going to be writing code in a thing called active record, but active record constructs these queries. So under the hood, so to speak, Rails does this exact thing, but we will not have to actually write the SQL at all. So we don't have to worry about the details of SQL. Joe mentions that a table is like a matrix of information, and that is correct. Can I show what I typed in the terminal again? I think it was shown in chat here. Sarah says, what is SQL Lite in relation to SQL? So SQL Lite is the name of a database, and SQL is the language that actually is this like thing I'm typing here, this insert into people, that again, you don't have to learn. So SQLite is a database, just like if you've heard of MySQL or SQL Server or DBase, those are all different database servers. Lil says, what does varchar 255 define? I'm not going to get into it, but you can think of it like a string. Ramsey says, is there a performance loss in using Rails over raw SQL? I don't think anyone here is worried too much about performance at this point, and I also think the answer is no. So we can talk about that sometime if you're interested, but I think probably outside of class. Rob says, does Rails ever use NoSQL? Yes, also outside the scope of the class though. Any kind of database can work well with Rails. The default is SQLite just because it's the easiest to set up. But then once you are putting that to a server, you would use something else like MySQL. Okay, we are going to keep going. So the next thing I need you to know, and these are a lot of things that we're not going deep on. And the reason we're not going deep is because you don't have to go deep on these things. They just have to know they exist. The next thing that I want you to know exists is there's a thing out in the world called Rubygems. So what Rubygems is a great website. Well, you'll probably never go to the website, but a great place where people write a bunch of code and then they make that code free for you to use in your applications. So you can think of it like a place where you can go and you can download other pieces of code. So for example, I'll just pick one at random here. If you needed something that, I don't know, if you were playing Acres 4.0, whatever that is, I'm guessing it's a game, and you needed a series of tools to make it easier, this is the gem you would use. It is just like it's like a pip in Python. It's like a Spark or a composer file in PHP. Every language has something like this. In Ruby, it's called gems. So the way that you install a gem is use gem install. But before we do that, because we're using SQLite, we need to install one more thing, which is we need to sudo apt install SQLite 3, or sorry, lib SQLite 3 dev. So what that is going to do, and I'll keep that up for a second so that anyone that's interested, or sorry, that needs it can copy it now, but sudo apt install lib Sqlite 3 dev it's a dependency of our Rails application. So in order to tell Rails how to work with Sqlite, we will need lib Sqlite 3 dev. No, we're not installing it inside. We exited the Sqlite terminal using Control D. So the two gems you'll need are, the two apt, and hopefully someone can copy this into the chat for anyone that is not getting it quick enough. These are the two things you'll need. You'll need Sqlite and lib Sqlite 3 dev. Okay, once you have those two things installed, you can gem install Rails. So again, gem is a package manager for Ruby, and it's going to install all the things that you need in order to have a Rails application. Okay, so look, 38 gems installed. That means that we have successfully installed Rails. Okay. Again, if someone is ahead on this and is able to take some of the install lines and create maybe some kind of post on the Slack or something, that would be really, really appreciated, because I don't have anything like that to give you after the class, unfortunately. Okay, so now we have Rails installed, but we haven't created a Rails application, but we can make sure it's installed by just typing Rails, and you'll see some output, a bunch of output. So we know that it's installed because we're able to talk to it. We can type Rails. No, if you have the code space and you keep it open, then every time you go back, it'll still be there. Okay. And I know you can do gorails.com/setup. That's good if you're doing it on your own computer, but for the class we're using code spaces. So if you do it here, that's going to make it a lot easier, because that means that we can all be talking about the same thing. I won't have the bandwidth to debug issues with your setup if you don't use code spaces. Yeah, I think anyone that's looking to install Rails, yeah, if you do Rails -- version, you can see that it's installed, and you can see that it's the most recent version. Anyone that's looking to install Rails on their own computer, I think you can definitely do that. You maybe use those instructions, or maybe don't. I can also help you, but what I can't do is, I guess, help you in relation to the class with that stuff, just because there's too many different environments. And really, code spaces is nice because it allows us to just all have the same thing. And Erica, I think that it is complicated to install the first time. It seems daunting, but it's really like a series of steps. And once you do it one time, you won't have to do it again. You also have the ability to just use code spaces until you feel comfortable getting to that stage. So that's nice. Okay, Richard says, will the sudo install save, for lack of a better word, when we return to code spaces? Yes, it will. As long as you don't destroy the code space using the little like trash can icon, then it'll be here every time that you come back in. It's the same machine. Essentially gets put to sleep and will come back up when you need it. Our racer says, is it better, easier to use Linux over Windows for web development? No opinion, and outside the scope of the class, we are just using code spaces. Anonymous tendencies, how do we pull up Rails example? You will not be pulling up Rails example. We will be making the Rails example. We're going to write it ourselves. And really, like pretty much for the rest of the course, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be working inside of a Rails application that we are about to build right now. Okay. The command to install code spaces, or sorry, Rails on code space is gem install Rails. And if you have trouble with particular things, we can debug that in Slack afterward. I just don't want to use everyone's time to debug it. So just drop the questions in Slack and we will get them figured out. Again, if you're using code spaces. If you're not using code spaces, you're on your own. Someone says, is Rails to Ruby like React, Vue, Angular, are to JS? And yes, is the answer. It is a framework for making your life easier in Ruby. And there's so much to it. There's so many different components, and we're going to talk about a lot of them over the next couple of days. Okay. So now we've installed Rails. Now we need to create a Rails application. The way that we do that is we use Rails new. It says that we need an app path. So we're going to make the app path. We're just going to use a dot, which is going to say, I want to install Rails in the current directory. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, wait, I wanted to put a README in here, but you already have a README. So you can choose if you want to use their README or your README. I'm going to use their README. So just hit enter and keep going. So now it's installing all of the things that it needs in order to set up your Rails application. So we'll just kind of let it going. We'll let it go. So that was Rails new dot is the thing that you'll use to create your Rails app. We can actually see if we go into here and we look at our README, we can see that Rails has like put a bunch of stuff into this README. Okay. You also see on the left-hand side that Rails has just added a ton of files here. Okay. So this is our Rails application. So we get all of this just by installing Rails. So now we've got like a real application with all this stuff. And you'll see that there's 81 changes over here, which we can, I can show you how to commit those in a minute. So we're continuing to wait here. We're waiting for Rails to install. We're waiting for it to download what it needs and set up all the things that it needs to set up. And then in a minute, we're going to start the Rails server, which is going to be, really cool. And I can, while this is installing, I'm down to answer any questions about gems or about any of the steps that we've just taken if people want more detail. Akil asks, can you connect Rails to a CSV or Excel spreadsheet? I mean, I guess theoretically you could, but part of the value of a database is that it runs on a server somewhere. So you want those things to be saved in like a safe way that that stays over time. So probably not in practice. Banan says an error that he got a conflict, just hit enter and it'll overwrite the README in your repository. And yeah, you are going to commit these Rails server files. So if you are trying to put your example into your repository, you can do that. It's going to put all of these files though alongside your current files. So if you had everything organized in a way that was making you happy, I know a lot of people had a nice organization scheme. You can either just let this stuff sit alongside of it, or you can you could either start a new repository, or you could create your Rails application in a subdirectory. But for the most part, I think just putting it in this regular main directory is fine, and it'll just be the easiest for us to all see the same thing. You think of this like these are Rails application where you're kind of just experimenting with a bunch of Rails things over the next couple of weeks. This is also where we're going to be writing all of our JavaScript code. And eventually it's going to finish. Okay, and it's done. So just to give you a kind of a quick look at the left-hand side here, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of files that exist over here. If I go into app, that's kind of the main directory where all the things are going to happen. And you'll see a couple of things stand out here. One is controllers, which of course from the model view controller, we saw controllers, models, and views. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the isolation, is we're talking about these things living in 3 separate places. Okay, so we're going to talk all about a whole bunch of different parts of this application, but just know that that's what's going on. There are kind of these subfolders under app, and that's where a lot of the stuff is. There's also a config directory, that has a lot of the default configurations for Rails. And then out here, there's a gem file. So a gem file lists all of the dependencies of our application. So all this like installing that happened here happened because this gem file lists the things that need to be installed in order for Rails to work correctly. So that's all handled for you. You don't have to really worry about that. Okay. So to start a Rails server, what we do is we type Rails server. It is intimidating, but it's going to be fine. You got it. So I type Rails server and look what happens. What happens is the code spaces has detected that we started a server, and now it's offering for us to forward that port out of the code space so that we can actually open it in a browser. Okay, so if I click open in browser, it's going to open a browser and it's going to show me an application. Now this is like a pretty not great looking thing, but this error is coming from Rails. So this is actually our Rails application running in the code space that we're seeing in a web browser. Okay. So what it's saying, this is fairly complicated, but what it's saying is that this line here, this line that's been output here, you want to copy it. You want to go into config, environments, development, and you want to place it in here. So it gave you the code that you want to place in there. And then once you place it in there, you're going to have to go down here, back into the terminal. If you don't get the error, that's okay. Go back into the terminal, hold Control and hit C. That's going to exit the Rails server. And then type Rails server again, you're essentially restarting it. So you're exiting it, and then you're bringing it right back. Click open in browser, and now you're going to see the actual startup page for Rails. So this is an actual web server running inside of code spaces, running Rails. So now we can write Rails code and actually see it in the browser. So just like to really at a high level say what's just happened is we had some Ruby code sitting in a terminal. We had some Ruby code sitting inside of code spaces. We had this main.rb file, and we were locked in this world where all we could do was control text inside this bottom box, right? And now, because we installed Rails and we've got this going, we're essentially able to escape that box and now be able to host a web page here that is connected to our Ruby code. So now for the first time, we can write Ruby code and have it do something in a web browser. So it's because of Rails and Unicorn or whatever web application server. It's because of those things that we're able to make the jump from just like some text in a box to, oh my God, we have a whole web page. Yeah, you can actually open each other's apps. When your code spaces goes to sleep, this server will stop. So just something to know. When the code space goes to sleep, your server is going to stop. So you can't host a web page here permanently. You'll have to use something like Heroku for that, which we can cover later. But we've got a real web server running and putting web pages out to the public internet, which is pretty amazing. And actually, if we go in here, and we'll go into this public folder. Okay. In the public folder, there's a file called, where is it? In here. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna skip this public folder part. Ignore the public folder for a second. Let's create a new file inside the public folder. and let's call it hello.html. And let's just write something inside of it, like hello world. Okay. Now, if we go back to our web browser, we can type /hello.html. We actually can see the code that we wrote inside that file out in the web browser. Okay. So we're able to create a file inside of the public folder and then be able to see it in a browser. Now, what we haven't been able to do, okay, I'm going to answer some questions before I keep going, and then I'm going to keep going because we have to get to a certain point. So, is there a server software for running Rails app locally? There is one. Yes, it by default is called WebBrick, and it is installed for you. So when you type Rails server, you're actually running that server software automatically. You don't need anything else. Dimple, I can talk about Django after the course. Sorry, after things are over, but I don't want to distract from it now because this is a Rails course. Paul Senior, I hope things are working, but if not, you can ask in Slack and we'll try to help out. Also, Joel has put together a really nice guide, kind of a 5-step guide to the things that you'll need to create a new Rails app over in Slack. Anonymous attendee says Rails server just displays some help functions. I'm guessing that there's like a space or something in between, because if it just displays help functions, then it is responding as if you're typing like just Rails by itself. So just make sure you're typing Rails server. Or I guess another thing to check is like if you haven't created the Rails app yet, then that would do that. Ramsey says if you change the code, you need to restart the server. No, that's not true. Only if you change something in the config directory. So we're not going to have to restart the server again. Okay. So hello world, and notice that we changed hello world, and the web browser instantly got our change. So we changed it to hello world, so now it's hello worlds. Okay. So we're going to make another leap right now, and the last leap that we're going to make for today, which is we are going to actually create a controller, because the controller, see, we've written some words here, but we haven't written any Ruby code. The controller is what's going to let us write Ruby code. Okay. So the first step is to go into the config directory, and we're looking for a special name file called routes.rb. And I'm going to explain all of this in depth, but for now, we're going to kind of blaze past it to be able to get a controller working correctly. In here, we're going to write root 2:home index. Okay, so just to break apart what this means really quick, is it means when you go to the root URL, meaning just the domain part like this, and then no hello.html, just the root, the base URL. When you go to that base URL, it says that you should go to, and remember, this is just a symbol. So you could also, if you wanted to, you could write this like this, to, and then this is just the string, nothing special happening here. It's all just Ruby. And it says home # index. And what that means is the controller named home and the action named index. Now, I haven't introduced those concepts, but we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to refresh the browser, and we're going to go to that home page. Let's see what it does. Okay, it errors. And it's erroring because we don't have a constant home controller. Okay. Now, Rails comes with an easy way to create new home controller. So if I want, I can actually close the server for a second by using Control-C again, and I can do Rails generate controller home controller. I'm going to hit enter. And now it's created a bunch of files for me because controllers kind of all work the same way. The most important one it's created, though, is app controllers home controller. So we can actually go and open that file. Okay. And I'm going to restart the server. And then let's refresh it again. Okay. So what it's saying is something different now. Now it's able to find the home controller, but it can't find an action called index on the home controller. So just to give you a brief introduction to what this means is the home controller is a class. That class inherits from application controller. So this is just a class in Ruby. It's nothing special. What a controller is just a class. Okay. Yeah, what I typed down here is I typed Rails generate controller home controller. Now remember, a Rails, a controller is just a class, just like all the other classes. So yes, this left side is super intimidating, but look, boop, not intimidating anymore. There's just a file called home controller with a class inside of it called home controller, which descends from a thing called application controller. And now actions are just methods inside of controllers. So we have a controller here called home controller, and we have an action called index. Okay, and now if we look at the routes file, it should make a little bit more sense what we wrote, even though the syntax is a little confusing. It's saying when you go to the root of the web server, that should go and execute the home controller's index method. The root of the web server should execute the home controller's index method. And we'll take as much time as you want on this. You know, I'll spend all day tomorrow doing this over and over again if we need to, because this is vital. This is the foundation of Rails, is the entry point from doing something on the internet and going to a web page, goes into the routes file, which then routes the request to the right place. If it's easier, another way you can write this is you can write get. I don't know if this is easier or not, but it's saying when you get just the regular slash, meaning like when you get the regular slash, just nothing, then use home index. Or you can say root to home index. Okay, so home controller is a class, and an action is just a method inside the class. Okay, so when we say root to home index, it says when someone goes to the root, send their request to the home controller and the method index. Okay, when you read something like this and it says home hash index, the way that you should actually read that is home controller.new.index. Make a new instance of the home controller and call index on it. Okay, home index. This translates to find a file called home controller, make a new instance of home controller, and then call the index method on it. I know it's confusing. Luckily, you're not going to have to spend a lot of time in here, but this is what's going on. And really importantly, I want to point out that these are just regular classes. There's nothing special about them at all. Okay. And then we have to do something inside of the controller. This is kind of the last puzzle piece to put together. And what we're going to do is we're going to render plain. Okay. Okay, render plain okay. And if I do that and I go refresh the browser, you're going to see it says okay. Okay, gonna answer some questions. So someone in the chat says, did anyone get a home controller index missing a template for a request? Yeah, if you're gonna get that until you write render plain okay. You have to write render plain okay, or you will get that error. Our array, so root is just the, if you go to google.com, that's the root. And if you go to google.com/John, then that is not the root. That is a path, it's called. It's not the root. So the root is just the term that we use for just the plain domain by itself, nothing after it. ND, an action, is just a method inside of a controller. Did you create the controller folder? No, it's created when you run Rails generate. I wrote a format without the equals greater than in the routes file. Yeah, I did. You can write it either way. So remember that we learned that these are the same. Symbol equals greater than is the same as writing 2 and then a colon. That these are the same thing. So choose either one. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Another question is why home and not home controller? I think probably more Rails developers have been confused by that than anything else in Rails. The only reason is because it's a little nicer to read here. That's it. And actually, there are other ways. There are other ways to write it, but this is the accepted way. This is the way that you're going to see it everywhere. So this is the way that I'm going to teach, just like this. So just know that home here, all that happens is Rails does this. They go name.capitalize controller. They take the name, they capitalize it, and they put controller on the end, and that's how they turn the first part of this into the class. That's how it works. Andrew says, are we on the controller part of MVC now? Yes, and that is the farthest we're going to go today. So that's the controller part of MVC. And I will do one more thing, which is now we're doing render plain okay. And if I refresh the page, we're going to see okay. And you're going to notice that it's in this like very plain text. And the reason is because, as you probably guessed, plain means plain text. So render plain okay. Now, this is not super interesting. So we're going to make it super interesting and prove to ourselves that this is just Ruby. And we're going to write, okay, the time is time.now. Okay. So now if I run this, we're going to see that every time that I refresh this page, make it a little bigger, every time that I refresh this page, a new timestamp comes out. So hopefully your mind is going like a little crazy right now, because you can essentially write any Ruby code that we've done so far inside of here and do anything you want, and then have it work in a web browser. So that's the power of Rails, and that is more or less like what we're going to spend the rest of the course on. We're going to spend the rest of the course seeing what happens with that power, right? Like now we have this plain text sitting in a web browser, but soon we're going to have HTML tags. We're going to have CSS tags. We're going to have all different ways to make the page look nice and function different and store data in the database. There's so many possibilities from here and so many different ways to go, but it all starts with you installing Rails, putting something in a route file, and then receiving the request in the controller. Okay. If you run Rails generate controller, home controller, it should make it Render plain OK just outputs something to the web browser. And can you host any app developed in other technology and code space in the web browser? Yes, you can, but the course is not about code space, it's about Rails. So we're going to focus on things related to Rails and Ruby, CSS, and JavaScript. If you get that the action index could not be found for home controller, you'll need to def index. You'll need to define a method on home controller called index. Make sure it's saved, and then it should work. Okay, homework. Your homework is, if you haven't already, I need you to set up Rails in your code space. I want you to start the server using Rails server or Rails S and view that page in your browser. Then I want you to create a root route and a controller that outputs in plain text a random name from an array of friends using the array sample method. The array sample method returns a single element from an array. So pretty similar to what we've already done. If you've been following along as I've been doing this, you're most of the way there. Homework should be pretty easy. I just want you all to get your code space set up with Rails and running so that tomorrow we can dig deep into the model layer of Rails, which is where we're going to do kind of our first explorations. Okay. Our Reso says, do we write HTML in the index method or do we add HTML file to it? You can add an HTML file to it. We'll see that later when we get into the view layer of the MVC architecture. Currently, all I want you to write in the controller methods is Ruby code. In particular, whatever Ruby code you want, and then a render call like this, render plain, and then some string. So the ability you have right now is you have the ability to write some Ruby code and then take a string and put it into the web browser. Okay, that's what we have built to. We've built to, Ruby, you have a web browser. That web browser can do anything you've learned so far and then output a string in the end. And we're going to keep building on that. We're going to keep stacking bricks. We're going to just keep going until you can make a web page that actually does something instead of just output the time. Okay, Tyra says, is there a fast way to commit all of that? Yeah, I will show that because I think it is important. So rather than go through each of these and click the plus, just go up to changes and click plus one time. Now everything's staged. Now you can click commit and you can say, this is my Rails installation. Now it's there. Click the little three dots, click push. Boop, it's all committed. Andrew says, should all code be in the same controller.rb file? No, eventually you'll create multiple controllers, but for now, yeah, there's going to be one controller. It's called home controller. It's just the first one we created, and eventually we'll create more. Anonymous attendee says, I created a new Rails app and tried to do Rails S after. It keeps displaying help function. Make sure that if you created the Rails app and you didn't use Rails new space dot, then that means you created the Rails app in a subdirectory, which you will need to change into that subdirectory using something like CD. So if you've done that, it's fine, but you will need to change into that directory to run the server. Yeah, you can push it in the terminal if you want to, if that's how you're doing things. Ernest, I appreciate it. I realize that this is very confusing and that there's a lot here. We covered a lot today. I mean, think about the fact that like you went from, in the past hour, we're talking 1 hour, you went from not knowing what Rails was to making a Rails app and actually being able to interact with it. And that's building on the foundation that you've all built up over the past 4 days in Ruby. And like I said, we'll spend as much time tomorrow as you want kind of rehashing this so that we can all be on the same page about what a Rails app is and how to create a basic controller. And then we're going to write more Ruby code. I mean, like at the end of the day, hopefully you're seeing based on what's inside this file, that a Rails app is just Ruby code. This is just a regular class, like all the ones that we've seen. It just has a regular method inside of it, and it just calls a regular method. This call to render is literally just a method call. I mean, like, there's nothing special going on here. It's just like another, like when we had the business class and we were able to call methods on it, Application controller essentially defines a method called render. And that's why we're able to call render. There's no magic or anything. It's like, here's a class, and now we can call render because it is implemented on the superclass application record, or sorry, application controller. Okay, I'll stick around for a bit if anyone has more questions, and otherwise I'll see y'all. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Okay, so Kevin says, how would we add another page if you wanted to link to another page instead of just having the date? Yeah, we're going to get into that, but basically the idea is that you would do the same thing, and instead of using root here, you would write get other page, home other page. When you do that, now you're defining another method called other page on index, and that's how you would create a second page. So hopefully that helps answer your question. And we're definitely going to do that. We're going to be doing that over the next couple of days. We probably won't do it tomorrow because tomorrow is going to be talking about models, but we will talk about it in the future. Richard says, I never saw the welcome page to Rails, but I got the okay time is. I think maybe you just didn't refresh the page in between. It's fine. If you have the thing working and it says, okay, the time is, then your Rails app's set up and it's working correctly. Anonymous attendee says, I work full-time as a Rails dev. This is my first job. Is it okay if I skip the last 2 days to get started from here? Sure, it's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, the class is for you. I don't really check the homework. I mean, I give people tips on the homework when they're maybe having trouble. And I do go through all the homeworks, but I'm not like giving scores or anything. So if you think that you can be caught up on it, then you're absolutely welcome to be here. Felipe, I can't show how to set up an app in AWS, but I do think that a good starter point for that is to set up an app using Heroku. So if you sign up for a Heroku account and you had something like this locally and you did Heroku create, it would go push that Rails app from your GitHub repository up to Heroku, and that would be a permanent web server. So instead of this web server that will essentially die anytime that you let your code space pause, that web server will not pause. So I think that would be a good place to start. And it'll also set up a database for you. Johnny says, do I have to install Sql app on my computer to have access with it? If you want to be able to install this on your own computer, then you need to install something like Sql Lite or MySQL or Postgres. That's going to be a requirement. We're not going to cover it in the course, but if you want to do that, you would have to have a database locally. Sqlite is the easiest one to have locally because it doesn't require, there's not like a service running in the background. It's literally just like a file. All the information is getting written into a file. And again, tomorrow we're going to cover models a lot more. As part of models, we're going to cover databases. So I did an intro to databases today, but tomorrow we're going to like actually use them. Kevin says, how long will I have access to code spaces after the bootcamp? I don't know the answer offhand, but they are just Git repositories. So if you want to keep your notes or you want to be able to keep that information, you can create what's called another remote, and then you can push the notes essentially to the other remote. So you'd be copying the information from this class over to that other class, or sorry, over to your own account, like you said. You can also download a zip copy of your repository at any time. Yeah, you can copy to your main account. So you'd create a repository over there, and then you either download it and re-upload it, or if you're interested in finding out more, you could look up Git remotes, and there's a way that you can essentially push one repository into another one if you're interested in that. And someone also just dropped a link in the chat. I appreciate it. But it's not like the course is not going to end and then your access is just going to be cut off. It might be a bit. I actually don't know the answer, and I just don't know. Cool. Rubina says, in a professional environment, we need to install Rails and set it up, or you'll be given a machine that has all of it set up. Yeah, Rubina, that's what I was saying kind of a little bit at the beginning of our session tonight, is I was trying to say that for the most part, even when you're a junior developer, you're coming into an environment at a company where they already have a Rails application set up. And I know a lot of like even senior developers that have never started a new Rails app. So this part is a little confusing. The whole like, how do you set up Rails? How do you get it running part? That's not something you're going to have to do. What you're going to actually have to do is you're going to have to go into a working Rails application and be able to know where all the pieces are. And that's kind of what we're learning here, is we're learning where all the pieces are. We're going to learn, hey, where are the controllers? Where do they live? How do they work? We're going to learn where are the views? How do they work? We're going to learn how do models write to the database. So that's what I'm hoping to teach you here. But as a prerequisite to teaching you that, we need to all create a Rails app, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to experiment on our own outside the class. Like I can show you everything that you need, but if you don't do it with your own hands, if you don't actually type the code, then you're not gonna get that kind of muscle memory associated with that. Yeah, it is hard to memorize. You can watch the videos again, and you can also just keep trying new things. A lot of times the errors from Rails are very clear. So you'll see an error and it'll maybe tell you that you typed something wrong or something like that. Rubina asks, how long have I been working with Ruby and Rails? I started working with Rails in particular in 2009, so 11 years. And I've done other things in the meantime. I've worked on different things, but yeah, 11 years. Thank you. Yeah, I know a lot about Rails. I used to consider myself more of like a generalist coder, but these days I definitely spend a lot of time working in Ruby and Rails. Yeah, I do work a little bit on Rails as well, like the actual framework. So Andrew says, so now we need to call methods not by using the dot, but by, yeah, that's a good point, and something that I probably should talk about. This is not calling a method, this is just the string. So what happens inside Rails is that it takes this string and it breaks it into two pieces. So it says, okay, the controller is home and the action is index. Actually, another way that you can write this, I believe, is you can write controller home and action index. I think this works, so we can actually verify. It's taking a bit to decide if, yeah, so that works too. So that's what we're actually writing. When we write to home index, this is what we're writing. We're writing root controller home action index. So the hash method has nothing to do with calling a method. It's just a way to write that root call a little bit more condensed. But this is what it's actually doing. It's doing root controller home action index. Okay. Another thing I will say is you might see me some places, like in the instructions here, I write array hashtag sample. This is when you're communicating about code. This is just how you indicate that the thing you're talking about is an instance method. If you were talking about a class method, this would be a dot instead. So it's just a shorthand for saying the instance method sample on the class array. Anonymous attendee says, do you use SQL statements outside of Rails ORM at GitHub? For the most part, no. Although there are some cases where you need to. The active record query generation has an underlying software called ARL that makes it, there's a lot of flexibility in using active record to generate queries. It can do a tremendous amount. It can do joins. It can figure out how to do inner joins, left joins, all kinds of complex database stuff. So the amount of actual SQL you have to write is very, very minimal. And that is a good thing, because for a lot of developers, SQL is confusing. And when something is confusing and you put it in the hands of someone that doesn't know what they're doing with it, then you can end up with security problems. Okay, cool. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to end the course for today, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.